Thank you everyone for joining and welcome to the session. My name is Sophia and I'm a junior consultant at Turner & Townsend. We're joined today by Hermione, and I'm going to leave it to you in 1 second, just like to give a brief introduction for yourself. But as a reminder, the purpose of the event, this is a Retrofit information, support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero, and then it's delivered by Turner & Townsend. Without further ado, I would like now to hand over to you, Hermione, and you can start the presentation.
Great. Okay, so hopefully everybody can hear me loud and clear. I'm Hermione. I'm from Permetric. So today we're going to have a look at evaluating the success of your performance and the role that data, your retrofit performance, and the role that data plays in that. So before we get too stuck in, I'll just explain where we're going. It's worth considering that some of the context here. So we'll do a quick review of the current state of play, funding, and the importance of quality in housing retrofit. Then I'm going to spend a bit of time on the role of building performance evaluation, and in particular data-led evaluation, and what role that has in balancing quality and retrofit delivery. And finally, we'll round off with a quick walk through the results from a project we did on data-led evaluation with London Borough of Havering. So earlier this year, we had a spending review confirming the more than £13 billion worth of investment for multi-year retrofit initiatives, which is going to be delivered through a combination of direct funding and supported loans from institutions like National Wealth Fund, and is largely targeted at fabric improvements, but also solar, heat pumps, and a range of other initiatives. We're expecting more details on the Warm Home Plan delivery in October, but provisionally, I suspect it will work in a very similar way to in its first few rounds of SHDF and WHSHF. But it's worth noting the rising emphasis on the quality of delivery around funding. We've got other regulatory requirements such as MEES, which, and the consultation on whether that gets applied to social housing. We've got AWAB's law coming in, the new Decent Homes standards, all of which focus on a performance in building and quality of delivery. A lot of this is being, I suppose, seen through the lens of EPC, but at the same time, we've got reforms being proposed to EPCs where the models that are used for EPC are not only being refined, but also some discussion about whether those models can take data and measurement as inputs into the models in order to improve them. And, further emphasis on sort of quality of delivery. We've seen consultations for existing funding streams like Eco4, looking at whether you can use data-led evaluation to, I suppose, validate that delivery has been good quality. So the emphasis is moving more and more to quality of delivery. The Minister has acknowledged that that is the case. And today we're going to have a look at how you might approach that. So when we're looking at evaluating quality in retrofit, I think of that as a process that's broadly known as a building performance evaluation. And today we'll have a look at what the motivations and use cases for BPE are, the techniques that are used, how data in particular can be used for it, and some practical first steps on how to make that work. This presentation really is going to borrow very heavily from an organisation called the Building Performance Network. If you haven't come across them, I heartily recommend a Google. They have excellent guidance on how to do BPE, all sorts of free detailed explanations and playbooks on evaluations for many different situations. Very well worth downloading. So what's been triggering the increasing interest in building performance evaluation? Much of it is driven by this concept of the performance gap, which is around the difference between the intention of the designer when it comes to trying to model the performance of the building, and what we see in terms of the real performance of the building when it's actually built. And that's not just about how much energy on CO2 a building consumes and emits. It can also show up as shortfalls in comfort. It can show up as performance deviations on ventilation rates or acoustics, or really any technical criteria for the performance of a building. So I've got two good examples of how performance gaps show up on this slide. On the left, there's a study from Build Test Solutions that looked at the assessment for the required size of heating system based on, how much heat a building loses. When BTS compared the heat loss assessments to actual measures of heat loss, they found that in 80 homes, these assessments were routinely overestimating the actual size of heating required. And that creates a performance gap, both in terms of the initial capital cost of heat pump systems, but it can also create performance issues with the heat pumps downstream and impact on bills downstream. So we can see that this is actually a performance gap driven by a failure in the assessment process. On the right-hand side of this slide, you've got another example that looks at ventilation in new builds, with some testing to discover whether the new builds are delivering the ventilation rates that they were designed to do. In fact, only 4% of new builds tested were meeting ventilation requirements. And in that case, you could be looking at a failure of the model or the design assessment, or you could be looking at a failure of the construction process. So these gaps, I suppose, that drive a performance gap, they can occur at many different points in the overall design point. So when you're doing an evaluation, you're principally aiming to collect the information that will help reduce performance gap on your project by providing information that's really useful to the whole project team. Your results could be used to quality assure work for your funders and supply chain. They can be used to communicate successes to the community, to residents, to the leadership team. They can provide feedback for future learnings, supply chain and designers. And if you have got yourself if you are in a position where you need some mandatory assessments like PAS 2035 or a heat loss survey, they can also be used to tweak the outputs from those in order to get better results from your mandatory assessments. So it's all about assessing quality, but how do we actually do it? What are the techniques that get used? Well, there's a range of options, most of which will provide part, if not all, of the picture. So it's often a case of selecting from the menu what suits your project best. The most basic thing to do is what pretty much everybody already does when considering retrofit. It's a construction review, collating what you already have on record regarding the construction and energy performance of your home. You can get this from EPC, from asset records, from other data in your organization. And it's very scalable and affordable, but it's often quite low quality. And in most cases during retrofit projects, and particularly funded retrofits, you're likely to find that you need to augment it with additional on-site surveys. Alongside that, you've got options to collect occupant feedback. That's a really underappreciated but powerful approach. It's very valuable in highlighting specific pain points, although it is obviously subjective. For gold standard and high confidence that you get the results you want from retrofit, more technical methods generate solid quantitative data on the performance of the building fabric. These complement occupant feedback with tests that measure the performance of the fabric alone. And that allows comparison of benchmarks before and after you've made the investment in the fabric of the building. So examples of these would be air pressure testing, thermography. Both of these are quite widely understood. I would say thermography is a little tricky because it's not really as accurate as it looks in terms of comparing one home to another. It can be quite challenging to calibrate it correctly. But there really is nothing better than thermography, where you know you have a home with a heat loss problem. Thermography is fantastic at identifying specifically where that problem is occurring and where the heat loss pathways actually are. And finally, and kind of the core of what I want to talk about today, there's a wealth of options now to collect energy on data on energy and environment within your home. It's really a lot more affordable and accessible than it was even 5 years ago. So I want to talk a bit about how we would use that data to make some measurements, collect some benchmarks that should support the quality delivery in your retrofits. So this next bit is in rather more depth and detail than the Building Performance Network guidance, but it's kind of important because we've got this new abundance of data, and that needs quite careful handling to make sure you get solid and accurate information. The first thing I would say is there is a difference between monitoring and measurement, and it's important to sort of get our heads around this. Monitoring will report conditions in homes day by day, month by month. It will allow you to spot homes that are deviating from what's normal. Measurement is taking the same data that monitoring delivers, but it's applying it into a consistent process, a test in essence, that allows you to compare performance between homes. And what that means is that not all monitoring data is suitable for particular tests and measurement. A very simple example, if you want to run a test or measure condensation risk in a bathroom, you're really going to struggle to do that with data from a thermostat in a hall. And so there are now, as I say, a lot of options for collecting environmental data in homes: smart thermostats, connected smoke alarms, data from heat pumps or TRVs. But it's really worth taking a step back and thinking about what tests or measurements you actually want before you assume that the data from those is going to be suitable. Obviously, there's also an increasing number of smart meters out there in the world. I would say they're very, very powerful and useful, but retrieving the data from them can be more effort than expected. So I've seen a lot of retrofit projects that are now budgeting for and planning for monitoring post-works. I think fewer have found a way to cover the testing pre-works, and I'd really advocate for trying to find ways to do that, because it's a much more meaningful set of measurements if you're able to actually understand what your baseline is, where you're starting from. Okay, so all of this data, you often find you've got an enormous amount of data coming out of every house, and so the key thing when you're trying to work through hundreds of homes in a retrofit is to turn that as quickly as you possibly can into a few key figures, a few benchmarks from each home that will actually move the needle and matter. So what do we think is a helpful benchmark? How can we compare the performance of a top floor one bed flat with a four bed semi-detached? Well, there are a number of things that I look for in a good benchmark. You want the measurements that reflect the performance of the fabric of the home as much as possible without too much influence from the residents. Another way of thinking about this, if you change the tenants tomorrow, how much might that number move? So you want also measurements that can be validated or tested for accuracy, bears a proven relationship to what's going on in the real world. And of course, you need measurements that you can make in an affordable way. We'll get onto that in a bit. We also want benchmarks that are meaningful for the people that are using them. We can, with a kit that we use, provide really technical benchmarks like heat transfer coefficient, scientific tests, physics-based numbers. And those are very useful for designers who need accuracy in the measurement and are familiar with building physics. But if you use that to talk to tenants, actually, that's not what they care about. They want to know more about the improvements in the comfort in their homes in terms of how many hours of warmth they get, or maybe how quickly their home cools down when you switch the heat off. That's scientifically less accurate, but a lot more meaningful for the tenant audience. So we can use the same data to provide both of these. It's more of a communications question as to, which benchmark works for which audience. Finally, of course, you want the measurements, the benchmarks that drive action, whether it's deciding which homes need to be prioritized, which homes might need some more assessment to understand whether there's a particular problem and what the root of that might be. So here's a quick example of a test process in action, and then we'll get into a little bit about what this delivers. This is really a standardized assessment for retrofit benchmarking. It's delivering information on heat loss, condensation mold risk, air changes or ventilation in the home, and comfort. We're using here data collection equipment where we know the performance of the sensors, we understand how to deal with data gaps. We know that we will be collecting data for 3 to 4 weeks. We have standardized locations for multiple sensors within the house. So, we know which rooms we want them in and we know where we want them in the rooms. And we have a process for how and when we collect energy data. In this setup, we're reading temperature, humidity, CO2 data in a home 3 to 4 weeks, and we're reading the meters at the beginning and at the end of the test process. And you do that. This is a process that's used before and after retrofit, and it's important that we use the same process each time. That said, it's really important to balance this accuracy of the test process against how easy it is to use and how acceptable it is to the residents. You need something that isn't going to require any change in behavior for the residents. You need to just have it sitting in the background quietly collecting data. So that's a sort of example of a fairly straightforward test process. Perhaps we can have a look at some of the results. So one set of results is one that I think people are very interested in at the moment is heat loss testing, which provides a clear measurement of a home's insulation, designed to identify stocks that would really benefit from fabric investment and also help size heating systems. This is a test that is generally done in the winter season, in the heating season, because we need heating energy in order to do it. It'll provide you with three main outcomes. One is the overall heat loss from the whole envelope of the home. Unhelpfully, which is the heat transfer coefficient, unhelpfully, that gets larger, that number, the larger the envelope. So in order to allow us to compare our one-bed flat with our four-bed semi-detached, what we do is we divide that by the floor area of the home to give you the heat loss parameter. And that allows you to compare the performance of different sized buildings. The heat loss is also a crucial input into the peak heat demand, which is essentially how much heating power you're going to need when you apply that level of heat loss on the coldest heating day of the year. So that's one example of a keen measurement. This should not be changing with tenant behavior. This is an attribute of the fabric of the home. So another attribute of the home that you may be testing for is looking at condensation, damp and mold risk. This one is important to look at alongside heat loss and ventilation because all three are interrelated. There are several vendors now who provide test processes to assess condensation risk. With the process we've just been talking about, we're using humidity data to identify moisture risks inside homes from several different locations. And that uses a risk model that's got two major factors. It looks at the average humidity for each location across the test period, and it looks at the duration and peak of the humidity events in the test period as well. And because we have data from a number of different homes, that means rooms. That means we're able to identify rooms and periods most exposed to the damp and leading to increased mold risk. Where that relates to heat loss and ventilation in particular is that if you have a home that is already quite close to having a condensation, damp and mold risk, you may want to pay particular attention to just how much you wish to cut back on infiltration and ventilation, or at the very least make sure you have a very aggressive ventilation strategy. So talking of ventilation, that's a tricky one to balance. It affects both heat loss but also health and people's health within a home. Because we're measuring CO2 in this test, we can use it to understand ventilation and its relationship with heat loss and CDM. Our tests use CO2 data to measure how quickly air is replaced in the space and give you basically an air change rate. And we also look at absolute CO2 levels in order to see if the air quality at any point in time is degraded and is likely to be causing problems in terms of an environment that might foster the exchange of viruses and things like that. It's not the same as air tightness in that this is affected by a resident's behaviour. If they open a window or they're closing trickle vents, you'll see this reflected in the air change figures. But arguably, that's actually a more realistic measurement of what is actually happening in a home that you're improving. Finally, we are also, because we have data on temperature, we're also on the right-hand side here using that to have a look at how many hours of warmth the home is provided. Generally, we think of that through the idea of how many hours of warmth between 18 and 22 degrees or 21 degrees is the home providing over the test period. And that's a really helpful thing to discuss with residents alongside energy bills because it gives them both how much it's cost and how much they're getting for their heating energy consumed. Okay, so that's the sort of benchmarks that we find useful in evaluation. So in retrofit, it's important to understand that we've all got barriers of time, cost, resident acceptance on this sort of thing. So we've got to design a process that balances the benefits of getting good measurements of performance against the overall costs of this, the time needed to actually make it happen in a busy project plan, and residents' reluctance to have you poking around in their homes. And specifically for retrofit, I think we're seeing an emerging sort of workflow that uses the lower cost methods initially, with more detailed investigations following on where they are needed. Now, for most publicly funded retrofit, you are likely to be needing additional surveys for compliance anyway, a PAS 2035 assessment, for example. And then you have a tentpole activity that can be expanded to include other forms of BPE. So, with a retrofit assessor in the building, you can basically conduct some form of resident survey. You can also put deep data sharing or put some data sensors in there to do some data collection. And those will both add time to the site visit, but you won't need to be booking a second visit with specialist resources. And then you have some good solid benchmarks that you can compare to post-work assessment. And they may also highlight the homes of more concern where you do need to get some specialist testing in, like air tightness or thermography, before you get too far down the road of rolling out your retrofit design. A complication here is that generally you'll get best results from resident feedback and technical investigations during the heating season. Funding rounds are often announced in the spring, and that can drive difficulties with scheduling. So many of our customers are starting to adopt a sampling approach where a percentage of each of their archetypes are tested. And that means that they can start work on first wave in an archetype as soon as the funding lands, while the second wave waits for testing over the winter and works in the new year, the next year. And that's a good strategy, although there are a couple of things to bear in mind if you're going to do sampling. Firstly, you need to be really confident you've got a true archetype. In other words, that your archetype is sharing common construction elements when you test a sample. And second point really is that we do find quite a lot of variability in performance in most archetypes. So it's better to be a bit generous with your sample sizing so that you can understand just how much variability there is in the performance of the fabric in your archetype, what your best case and your worst case performance might look like. We're finding you get generally quite good results with 20 to 25% sample rate. That is often, enough to allow you to see what good, bad, and average looks like in each archetype. Great, Sophia. Okay, so once you've put work into delivering all of these benchmarks and results from your measurements, you've got these valuable assets that you can and should really be sharing with quite a few different stakeholders who are going to be interested in the outputs of the project. Of course, the results don't just have to stay in the software platform. They can go to integrated into asset management systems, get turned into technical reports, into case studies, occupier feedback reports that you can give to a tenant liaison officer. And this is a table that just gives a few ideas on how that information can be shared, and you can really squeeze as much value out of it as possible. Residents in particular, we're finding quite a lot of use of this for resident feedback to provide reassurance on the impact on their comfort, their mold risk, their bills. Sometimes it's about suggesting ways in which residents might change their habits to engage more productively with the new environment. For asset managers, this is data that is really helpful on highlighting risks and managing risks around compliance and energy efficiency or CDM. A lot of the good contractors now are very interested in using data to demonstrate the impact of the work they do, and also to do tests that quickly highlight where there's any defects or things that they need to intervene on. And for sustainability managers, of course, this stuff is the bedrock for demonstrating your return on investment as far as retrofit is concerned, and making the case for the next round of investment. So we did talk a bit about resident attitudes earlier in this conversation, and I know it's a hot topic, and I think there's three kind of main points to bring forward here. So, how are we going to use evaluation to maximize the benefit to residents? How do we minimize disruption for them as well? And actually, at what point in the whole plan do we start the conversation? And I'm an advocate really of using the data as much as possible, using examples of the data for quite early engagement, because it can take a while for people to understand where this data is coming from and how it relates to them. I mean, residents can definitely find evaluation helpful, but it does work best when it's as transparent as possible. They know what to expect. They're not naive about data gathering. Some are frankly outright suspicious. So it's really helpful to be transparent about it and give them the option to see the data you're gathering and some of sort of the tests that you might use it for. And that can be presented as part of the initial recruitment exercise. In fact, alongside, things like showing people occupier feedback, pictures of what a better home looks like, results from interviews. Some people respond really well to seeing the results in numbers and in data as well. They find that compelling. On the drawbacks, I'm sure you'll all appreciate the number one problem is, of course, scheduling visits, and then any disruption within the home is often a barrier too. So it's better to choose sensor systems that can be installed alongside surveys very easily. Don't need any disruptive works. That's a useful win. And finally, I guess it's really crucial to be clear with residents why this data is being collected, how long it will last, and that the data that's collected is actually theirs under GDPR. I need hardly add, if your measurement provider really has to be able to support GDPR frameworks and deal with resident inquiries on that front efficiently. So that's all a bit of the theory. Let's have a look at how this works in practice. This is a project that we do, London Borough of Havering. It's a couple of years old now, on one of the earlier waves of SHTF across 2022-23. These homes, we tested actually rather more than 50 homes across 7 different archetypes and across 2 test periods, 2 winter periods. The works that were being done were mostly EWI, but also some heating controls, some door and window upgrades. And the purpose of the testing really was to give information for design decisions, to help understand whether the performance was, the works were delivering what was expected, and to talk to residents and funders and give them some confidence that, the money spent had delivered good results. In this case, we did data collection alongside the contractor, or we trained the contractor to do the data collection because they were on site in quite a number of homes doing some technical survey work. They picked it up very rapidly and pretty quickly got to the point where the time spent to set up the test, including discussing GDPR consents, was typically taken less than 30 minutes. So it's a pretty efficient way to get this all dealt with. The data that came out of this and the benchmarks that came out of this was used initially to look at CDM risk, understand which homes had the worst performance in terms of their fabric losses and their ventilation rate. And then it was the post-works testing was used again by Havering to have some discussions and support residents in what was effectively, in many cases, quite new homes for them. A little bit of a side quest. We used some of these measurements to sit alongside SAP models to have a look at how well the SAP models were doing in forecasting the potential improvements in the home. What we found was that the measurements for the SAP models on the homes that hadn't been improved, the measurements differed a lot from the SAP models. But when we moved to the measurements from the homes that had been improved, the measurement and the model agreed much more closely. And the lesson we learned from that, I guess, is that it's a great deal easier to build an accurate SAP model when you're actually you have all of the data on what is going into the home. Pre-works, you're often, with SAP models, taking an educated guess on what the build of the house may be, and it's easier to those models to deviate from what reality is. And the good news is that, post-works, these tests were showing significant improvements in most homes. There were a few where further interventions were needed. Across the board, overall, we had 26% reduction in heat loss and a reduction in ventilation, or an improvement in ventilation of 55%. No trace of there being a CDM or a moisture risk. So just to get into the data in a bit more detail, this is perhaps the sort of summary you might find if you integrate this stuff into an asset register. All of these homes now are EPCC in theory, But note they still show quite a range of HLP, heat loss parameter figures. So from 1.4 up all the way up to 2.3. And we've got two archetypes in this table. So there's a distinct difference in performance between these two archetypes. B has an average reduction in heat loss of 24%, doesn't seem to respond as well to EWI as archetype D, which is getting to nearly 30% heat loss reduction. It's also worth noting that, the heat loss for archetype B does vary a lot more across that archetype. So it's more of a, it is a sort of set of homes where there's more challenges, I think, around delivering EWI that works really efficiently for residents. All the homes now have low condensation risks, even though the background ventilation rates are now reduced. So, we'll be confident going forward that these homes, the fabric is well designed to deal with damp and moisture management. Behind all of these averages, there are individual homes with individual stories, and these are the stories that are really relevant to residents and help understand actually how retrofit is received, I guess. So I got a couple of homes here that tell quite contrasting stories. In both cases, what we've got are the results from the comfort tests done a year apart, before and after improvement. So in House A, what we're seeing is you've got a house that doesn't, on the face of things, doesn't seem to be showing an enormous amount of improvement. These graphics are basically representing how many hours of warmth is being delivered during the test process. Warmth is between 18 and 21 degrees. And you can see that in January 2023, there's a slight reduction in overheat. But broadly, this is a home that's always been kept at fairly high and consistent temperatures. However, if you look at the data on energy consumption and the external temperature, you do see where the improvements come in. Your gas consumption has fallen significantly from 7 meters cubed in February 22 to just over 4 meters in January 23. And this is despite the fact that the average external temperature is a lot colder in 23, at just under 6 degrees compared to 9.5 degrees in the earlier year. So really, this is a classic case of a resident who's continuing with a heating regime that suits their lifestyle, but they're taking the benefit of the retrofit in a lower energy bill. In contrast, this home, which is in the same archetype, tells a very different story. They've seen a very significant improvement in comfort between the 2 years, and the tenant is now enjoying much warmer conditions in their home. They've opted, I think, to take the benefit of the retrofit by keeping their home much warmer. However, because we have the much colder conditions in January 23, actually their gas consumption has risen a bit. It's gone up to 5.5 meters cubed from just over 4. So I assume that's all still operating within that budget and within their budget. And what they're choosing to do here is pay a small amount more for more affordable energy and to get more affordable warmth in their home. So that's two very different stories that could be discussed both with these residents and also with future residents, some of whom will relate more to the story of House B than to the story of House A. And it's really most powerful when you put it alongside other BPE techniques like occupant feedback to help you understand the impact of your retrofit. So with that example, I'll finish the main part of this right here. I hope I've kind of given you some practical insights into how building performance evaluation might work within your project. If anyone is now inspired to revisit your retrofit project plans to incorporate more evaluation, I'd be very happy to take questions on how it all fits in, or questions on anything else related to BPE. Thanks a lot.